Analysis of Acquainted with the Night by Robert Frost. This quiet and mysterious poem follows a speaker who is acquainted with the night. The poem is often seen as describing the familiar human experiences of isolation and despair. As the speaker walks through and is acquainted with the literal night, let us explore what this could represent. Let's get into it. In between the lines. To begin, I'll read the poem. Acquainted with the Night. I have been one acquainted with the night. I have walked out in rain and back in rain. I have outwalked the furthest city light. I have looked down the saddest city lane. I have passed by the watchman on his beat and dropped my eyes, unwilling to explain. I have stood still and stopped the sound of feet when far away an interrupted cry came over houses from another street, but not to call me back or say goodbye. And further still, at an unearthly height, one luminary clock against the sky proclaimed the time was neither wrong nor right. I have been one acquainted with the night. Frost's poems often feature simple vocabulary. This allows his few instances of more curious words to easily stand out. The title is made particularly interesting because of the potential in the word acquainted. The poem will talk about what it means to be acquainted with the night. Even without looking at the stanzas to come, we can start to attach some meanings to this night. Night is often associated with not just literal but also emotional and spiritual darkness. In contrast, today, the night is quiet, lonely, and pregnant with unseen dangers. On the flip side, the night is also a time of solace and calm, a time of rest and reflection. We'll soon see which side of the night the speaker is acquainted with. Let's take a look at acquainted. It is quite a formal, stoic word. There is some familiarity, but also some careful distance. An acquaintance is not a friend. Being acquainted with someone means you have a relationship with them, but that relationship is either a shallow one, one-dimensional, or exists within well-defined parameters. This distance might foreshadow the theme of human isolation and loneliness that the poem will get into. The speaker, I imagine, shares a relationship with the night, but might not be friends with the night. We should later understand what that might mean. Line 1 adds some context to the title and establishes a speaker. The line begins with I, just as the next 4 lines, creating an anaphora that puts the focus on self. As we glance down the coming lines, we see I have been, I have walked, I have outwalked, I have looked, I have passed, and again in the last line, I have been. Based on this anaphora, we can expect a poem that deals with a single person, one that focuses inwardly. Anyhow, back to line 1. I have been one acquainted with the night. We have here a speaker who claims to have an acquaintance with the night. Literally, this might mean that he is often out and about at nighttime. Perhaps he enjoys taking long walks. Perhaps his job makes it necessary for him to be up and about in the night. Whatever the case is, he's quite familiar with the night and all that comes with it. As I look at the present perfect tense in I have, a number of complications come to mind. As opposed to saying I am acquainted with the night, he says, I have been one acquainted with the night. This might be to say that he has a long-standing relationship with the night. The have been can be used to indicate that this acquaintanceship has spanned a long time. Another possible meaning of the I have been is that the speaker is no longer acquainted with the night. He has been acquainted, but no longer is. This meaning, the entire poem would be a reflection on the speaker's past and on how he used to have a relationship with the night. However, either interpretation is just as valid. So on the literal level, we have a speaker who is familiar with the night. On the deeper level, we have a speaker who is familiar with sorrow, loneliness, isolation. In this reading, the word acquaintance is ironic, as what he is acquainted with is loneliness. The word speaks of the speaker's connection to isolation. He is connected to disconnection. If one takes regular midnight strolls, they're bound to end up walking in the rain from time to time. In line 2, our speaker tells us how acquainted with the night he is. He has walked out in rain and back in rain. He's traveled in the rain both to and from his home. If one is on the road at night and it begins to rain, of course they must still find their way home. But this speaker has also walked out in rain. He must really love walking at night to leave his house in the night rain. This suggests that he is more than just acquainted with the night. Perhaps against his will he must go out in the night. Or perhaps he has a deeper connection to the night than he lets on. He might even be addicted to the night. The rain, metaphorically, could be sadness. Often tears are compared to raindrops. The repetition of "in rain" is an epistrophe, one that might signal the relentlessness of the rain, the ceaselessness. It is raining and raining. Just so his tears might be flowing and flowing. The sadness he is acquainted with is immense. It's not like a light drizzle, but it is like an unending shower of flood. The caesura, the dash in the line, further extends the raining, adding even more emphasis to how ceaseless the rain is. In the next line, we see that he has outwalked the furthest city light. He has walked for so far and for so long that he has walked past the furthest city light. This means he has walked to the edges of, and perhaps even out of the city. He might have ended up in the woods or on a beach or on some abandoned roads. Whatever the case, we see that he has walked deep into darkness and isolation. The city light could represent a sense of companionship, a connection to the city. The city light is meant to contrast with the dark. So if the dark is isolation, the city light must be human connection. But he has reached a point where he has stopped connecting with anyone. The depth of the isolation is underscored using the superlative furthest. We see another superlative in saddest in the next line. Also, as the speaker walks past the furthest city lights, we can notice a lot of diction scattered throughout the poem that speaks to distance, which is the measurement of isolation. First, we had acquainted. Then we have the walking out in line 2. By walking out, perhaps even by walking out on someone, one achieves distance. In line 3, we have outwalked and furthest. We see far away in line 8. We see further in line 11. Before we go to stanza 2, I find the word outwalk to be curious. It is not necessarily the same as walked past. Outwalk could suggest, through personification, that the city light was also walking. In fact, the primary meaning of outwalk is to walk further than another. In this case, the city light is not an inanimate object. The light, which is human connection, was walking with him, perhaps trying to catch up to him. But the speaker outwalked the light. The speaker is making a concerted effort to isolate himself, to avoid human connection. He watches the phone rings until it becomes a missed call. He quiets himself and hides when someone rings the doorbell. He turns down invitations to parties. In line 2, he walked out in the rain, and in line 3, he outwalks the city light. Stanza 2. The speaker has looked down the saddest city lane. This line took me by surprise, because in the previous line, we had the city light. The city light seemed to be the force of human connection. But now the city lane is sad. Literally, this might mean that from time to time, the speaker's night walks would take him maybe to the worst parts of town, maybe the poorest parts. But let's not be too concerned with the literal for now. The deeper meaning could be the speaker has seen the darkness in others, the sadness of the city. Remember, it is not he who is the saddest in this line, but the city lane. This can be both personification and metonymy. It is personification because the lane is sad, and metonymy because the city lane represents its inhabitants. Perhaps he outwalked the city light because he knew that deep down, the whole city is somehow sad and isolated. Perhaps the slight sibilance in saddest city is meant to return us to the audial imagery of the rain spoken of earlier. It is raining over this sad city lane. It is raining and it is dark. Remember, we have already outwalked the furthest city light. So if it is raining heavily, which means the sky is overcast, then there is neither moonlight nor streetlight to save the city lane from darkness. The absence of both natural and man-made light could mean the absence of both human and divine connection. The people are not connected to each other. Neither are they connected to God. Let's not stretch it too much. Let's go to the next line. I have passed the watchman on his beat. So back to the literal walk. The speaker has outwalked the furthest city light and has now passed the watchman. What is this watchman even watching so far beyond the furthest city light? Perhaps the very border of the city. The watchman is on his beat, on his watch, on his duty, on his time. This concern with time is again seen in stanza 4 with luminary clock. We'll get there eventually. The watchman here is an important element of the poem, as he's the only other person explicitly mentioned in the poem, besides our speaker, of course. He can therefore represent the chance to connect with another person. He may also represent the social safety we feel when we connect with others. Being a watchman, linking him to safety is only natural. However, the speaker does not want this connection nor this safety. In the next line, instead of speaking with the watchman, he drops his eyes, unwilling to explain. He is unwilling to explain his night walk, where he is going or coming from, why he is out so late, and why he is so far out from home. This dropping of the eyes also suggests that the speaker feels ashamed. He's ashamed to be seen out here in the cold, wet dark all by himself. Perhaps we are ashamed of our loneliness. This might be why it is so comforting to have 2,000 friends on Facebook, or to get 200 likes or 50 comments on a post. The isolation we feel is shameful, and so we find ways to avoid facing it. Stanza 3. I have stood still and stopped the sound of feet when far away an interrupted cry came over houses from another street. Here we see that the speaker continues to avoid human interaction. There is an interrupted cry from across the street, and he stops the sound of feet. He stops walking so no one hears him. The speaker might have been startled by the cry. He's in the dark and the sudden cry breaks the silence. The cry is far away though, and so he cannot see who is crying, let alone connect with them. Not that he wants to anyway. The cry is certainly far away, seeing as it came over houses from another street. Cry here might mean a sound like a scream, but it could also extend on the sadness from line 4 and on the rain from line 2. The crying could be weeping. In any case, the cry is short-lived. It is, as the speaker strangely puts it, interrupted. As quickly as the sound appeared, it disappeared, leaving the place again silent. The sudden sound might be heard in the constant t sound in stood still and stopped, while the sudden silence that followed might be heard in the consonant s sound in stood still and stopped, and houses from another street. In the next stanza, we do not see what the cry is, but we see what it is not. But not to call me back or say goodbye. How strange that the speaker seems concerned about the meaning of the cry. He sounds disappointed that the cry he heard was not for him. Even though he seems to be avoiding human connection, he still seems desperate for someone to reach out to him. Perhaps as he passed the watchman with his eyes down, he was actually hoping for the watchman to say hello. Perhaps as he walked out in the rain in line 2, he wished desperately that someone would have called him back in. In the next 2 lines, having perhaps given up on connecting with another person, the speaker turns his attention to the skies. Perhaps the rain has stopped, as the sky seems to be clear enough for him to see the moon. Line 11 adds even more diction of distance with further still and unearthly height. He sees the moon to be a luminary clock, a vague timepiece that provides no sense of direction, but instead a sense of passing, a sense perhaps of urgency. Time is going, and his life is wasting away. He is yet to make any meaningful connections, and it seems time will run out before he does. The metaphor of the luminary clock is not far-fetched. We use the moon to time seasons and phases of the month. The moon's domination of the sky also marks time, differentiating night from day. In the last 2 lines, we see, through personification, what the luminary clock proclaims. Proclaimed the time was neither wrong nor right. Since the beginning of the poem, we have been seeing pathetic fallacy, which happens when nature reflects the feelings of a character. We saw the darkness of the night as well as the rain. Now we see the luminary clock that tells him that the time is neither wrong nor right. In other words, it provides no answers, no sense of direction. This proclamation of the moon is a reflection of the speaker's despair and confusion. The last line, being the same as the first, tells us that nothing has really changed over the course of the poem. The poem was not a progression, but an explanation of the initial statement. We now see what it means to be acquainted with the night. Let's take a look at the poem's form. We see 4 tercets and a couplet, with a rhyme scheme of ABA, BCB, CDC, DED, EE. We can see that the second rhyme in each line becomes the first and third rhymes for the next line. This makes it a type of chain rhyme. Check out the analysis of Stopping by Woods for another type of chain rhyme. The analysis of that chain rhyme is much more in depth than this one will be. So this specific chain rhyme of interlocking tercets is called a terza rima. If you want to put a label on this form of poem, you could call it a terza rima sonnet. It has the form of a sonnet, except that instead of having 3 quatrains, we have 4 terza rima tercets. Like a sonnet, we end with a rhymed couplet. Why would Frost choose to use this specific variation over a regular sonnet? It might be because of the poem's message or story. Traditional sonnets contain some kind of turning point at which a question is answered or a problem is solved. However, this speaker gets nowhere. Nothing is answered or solved, and so the traditional sonnet would not have been appropriate. In terms of meter, we have the iambic pentameter throughout the poem, the meter of sonnets. Let's read the poem and keep its time. By the way, check out the lesson on meter if you haven't already. In this lesson, I am assuming you have a handle on meter. I have been one acquainted with the night. I have walked out in rain and back in rain. I have outwalked the furthest city light. I have looked down the saddest city lane. I have passed by the watchman on his beat, and dropped my eyes unwilling to explain. I have stood still and stopped the sound of feet, when far away an interrupted cry came over houses from another street, but not to call me back or say goodbye. And further still at an unearthly height, one luminary clock against the sky proclaimed the time was neither wrong nor right. I have been one acquainted with the night. In a few places, the meter does create slight unnatural stresses. For example, listen to line 11 again, read within the meter. And further still at an unearthly height. Now listen to it read more naturally. And further still at an unearthly height. Anyway, barring those small inconveniences, the meter seems steady and perfect. This might reflect the steady journeying of the speaker, the lack of progression or change, the constancy of his isolation and loneliness. Well, those are my 10 cents on this poem. What poem should I analyze next?